The morning sun spilled over the rolling fields of wheat and the low hills that framed the Doyle farm. A rooster crowed somewhere near the barn, and the scent of hay drifted in through the open window. Frank Doyle, 60 years old, was already awake. He moved with the slow steadiness of a man who had worked the land long enough to know every sound, every shadow that didn't belong. His back hurt some mornings, but his hands were still strong. Frank had served 20 years in the Army before retiring to his father's land outside Redfield, Kansas. The military had taught him order, endurance, and silence. Farming in a strange way was similar, just with fewer explosions. His wife Martha ran the household and handled the accounts. She was calm, grounded, the kind of woman who could turn a storm into routine. Their eldest son, Luke, 21, had stayed after high school to help his father. The boy knew the machines, the rhythm of planting, and the quiet patience cattle required. Emily, 19, was away at the State University studying journalism, but came home most weekends. She brought laughter and the sound of modern music that Frank didn't quite understand but didn't mind. The youngest, Tommy, 15, still caught the school bus at the end of the dirt road and sometimes complained about farm chores, though Frank saw in him a spark of independence he admired. By all accounts, life was steady. The Doyles grew wheat, soybeans, and kept about 40 head of cattle. They weren't rich, but the bills were paid, and supper was always warm. In the evenings, Frank often sat on the porch watching the horizon fade from gold to blue. "Peace," he'd say softly, as if afraid to jinx it. That peace began to shift one Friday afternoon. A black SUV rolled slowly down the gravel road and stopped by the fence. Two men in pressed suits stepped out, their shoes collecting dust they clearly weren't used to. The older one smiled broadly and called out, "Mr. Doyle, I'm Charles Weston and Company Real Estate Development. We're offering to purchase your land at a generous rate." Frank wiped his hands on his jeans and met them by the gate. "This land's not for sale," he said simply. Weston chuckled like he'd heard it before. "We're buying several properties around here for a new resort community. It'll bring jobs, tourism, a better economy. Think about it, this could set your family up for life." Frank looked past him toward his wheat field, still green and moving in waves with the wind. "My life's already set right here." The men left polite cards promising to follow up. As the SUV disappeared down the road, Frank felt a heaviness settle in his chest, the kind that used to come before an ambush. That night at the dinner table he mentioned the visit. Martha frowned but said little. Luke slammed his fork down. "They're buying out the Jenkins place already. Heard old Harold told them no last week." Frank nodded slowly. "Then they'll push harder." In the days that followed, a quiet unease spread through the neighboring farms. Letters arrived, offers doubled. Harold Jenkins, Frank's longtime friend and fellow veteran, came by to talk. "They want all of it," Harold said. "Every acre between the ridge and the creek." I told them no. You should too. Frank stared out toward the setting sun, its light cutting through the wheat like a blade. "They'll come back," he murmured. He didn't know then that this convey a few weeks passed since the men from Weston and Company left their cards at Frank's gate. Nothing seemed different at first, just the usual rhythm of early summer, fixing fences, cutting hay, checking the irrigation lines. But then one morning, Luke found a cow lying stiff near the creek, its eyes glazed foam around its mouth. Frank crouched beside it, running a hand along the neck. The animal had been healthy the day before. No signs of illness. "Could be poisoning," Luke muttered. Frank frowned. "Could be," he said quietly, though something deeper in his gut told him it wasn't accidental. They called the local vet, who took samples and left with a shrug. "Might be bad feed, maybe something in the water," he said. "Happens sometimes." Frank didn't argue, but his mind was already working through the possibilities. He'd cleaned that trough himself, and the feed came from the same supplier he'd trusted for 10 years. The next morning, another cow was dead, this one closer to the barn. And by the end of the week, 2 more. It wasn't disease, it was deliberate. Frank drove to town to file a report. The sheriff listened halfway, chewing a toothpick. "Frank, I know it's frustrating," he said, "but unless we've got proof someone's doing it on purpose, there's not much we can do." "Proof," Frank snapped. "You think cattle drop dead one by one from bad luck?" The sheriff sighed. "I'll send someone to take a look." No one ever came. Over the next days, small troubles started piling up like storm clouds. The feed supplier in Dodge City stopped returning calls. A local buyer suddenly postponed the wheat order he'd promised last month. Even the bank sent a letter about a routine review of Frank's credit line, something they hadn't done in years. Martha noticed his silence growing heavier. "Maybe it's just coincidence," she offered one evening. He didn't answer. Coincidence had a pattern, and this one was too neat, too coordinated. Then Harold showed up at the door one night. He looked worn out, his hat clutched tight in his hands. "They got me, Frank," he said, voice trembling. "Every one of my cows is dead. The vet says it's disease, but that's bull." He laughed bitterly at his own pun. "Bank's calling in my note next week. I can't pay it without stock. Weston's man stopped by this morning, said he'd make the debt disappear if I sold." Frank's chest tightened. "You didn't." Harold looked away. "I told him I'd think about it." Frank poured him a drink, the old whiskey they saved for winter. They sat in silence for a while, the crickets outside filling the space between words. "They're coming after us all," Frank said finally. "First with money, then with pressure." Harold nodded slowly. "Feels like the kind of war where you don't hear the bullets till you're hit." 3 days later, Frank woke to see Harold's truck parked on the ridge by his property. The engine was running, door open, radio playing faintly through the dawn. Harold sat slumped inside a pistol on the seat beside him. Frank froze. The world around him went still, no wind, no birds, just the steady hum of the idling engine. By the time he reached the truck, it was too late. The sheriff's men came muttering about financial stress, about pride, about men who couldn't adapt. But Frank knew better. His friend hadn't lost hope on his own. Someone had taken it from him piece by piece. That night, Frank stood alone by the fence, staring into the dark fields. Somewhere out there, someone was poisoning not just cattle, but lives, forcing men like Harold to their knees. He tightened his fists around the wire and whispered, "Not me, not this land." The funeral took place on a grey Tuesday morning. The small church on the edge of Redfield was packed with neighbors, veterans, and farmers who had known Harold Jenkins all their lives. The choir sang softly, but the sound felt hollow in the air. Frank sat with Martha and his sons near the front pew, staring at the closed casket draped in the folded American flag. Harold's wife, Linda, looked like a ghost of herself. When the service ended, she approached Frank outside under the cloudy sky. Her eyes were red but dry now, as if she had no tears left. She reached into her coat pocket and handed him a small brown envelope. "He wanted you to have this," she said. "He left it with me a week ago. Said it was in case something happened." Frank hesitated, staring at the handwriting, Harold Jenkins, bold and firm, written with a mechanic's pen. "Linda, you sure?" She nodded. "He said you'd understand what to do with it." Then she turned and walked away, her shoulders trembling beneath her shawl. Back home, Frank sat at the kitchen table for a long while before opening it. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Martha watched him from the counter, worry etched across her face. Inside the envelope was a folded letter written in Harold's careful block print. "Frank, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. They've broken me down piece by piece. I tried to hold out, but they hit every angle, the bank, the buyers, the feed, the county inspectors. Weston's people didn't come with guns. They came with paperwork and threats. I saw men in suits meeting the sheriff behind the diner. You were right, this is coordinated. Don't trust anyone from the county office. They're all bought. I'm sorry I couldn't fight longer. I know you will. Harold." Frank stared at the words until they blurred. He folded the paper carefully as though it might burn if he touched it too long. Then he rose from the table and walked out to the porch, needing the open air. The fields stretched before him endless and silent. The wheat swayed gently gold against the dim sky. Somewhere out there, Harold had walked the same kind of soil, fought the same kind of battle. Martha stepped beside him. What did he say? Frank handed her the letter. She read quietly, her lips tightening. "You can't go up against them alone," she said. He shook his head. "If not me, who will?" That night, after everyone was asleep, Frank went into the barn. The smell of oil, hay, and earth wrapped around him like old memories. He opened a metal chest that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were relics of another life, a field jacket, a weathered pair of dog tags, and a green notebook filled with coordinates and names from his time overseas. Beneath them lay a compact field camera, still working. He ran his thumb over the metal edge. "You always said fight smart, not loud," he murmured, remembering Harold's voice during their deployments. The next morning, Frank rode out across his property with Luke. They checked the fences, tested the water-collected soil near the creek. Luke noticed his father's silence. "You think whoever did this to Harold is coming for us?" Frank looked toward the ridge where Harold's truck had been found. "They already have," he said, "but this time they picked the wrong man." When evening came, Frank sat again on the porch, the letter folded neatly in his pocket. He gazed across the wheat field glowing under the sunset and spoke softly into the wind. "You didn't die for nothing, Harold. I swear to you I'll find every one of them." The prom summer settled over Redfield like a heavy blanket. The wheat was tall and gold, almost ready for harvest, but Frank no longer looked at his fields with peace. Each sunrise reminded him of Harold's empty farm on the ridge. Each sound at night made him reach for the old instincts that never truly left him. Frank had read Harold's letter a dozen times. Every word carried a direction, a clue. So he decided to act quietly as he'd once done overseas, when survival depended on patience and precision. He dusted off his old military gear stored in the barn's loft, a small infrared binocular, a trail camera, and a handheld recorder. They still worked. "Let's see who's been visiting my land," he muttered. Luke noticed his father's renewed intensity. Together they set up cameras around the watering troughs, the feed barn, and the north fence line. Luke ran the wires while Frank marked the coordinates in his worn notebook. "If someone's been poisoning the water," Frank said, "we'll catch them this time." Days passed. At first, nothing happened. Then, just after midnight on a Thursday, Frank's motion alarm buzzed. He woke Luke and they crept out through the darkness, careful not to startle the cattle. From the ridge, Frank used the infrared binoculars. Down near the creek, a truck sat with its lights off. Two figures in overalls poured something into the water. Frank's jaw clenched. "Got you?" he whispered. They watched until the truck drove off toward the highway. The camera near the creek had recorded everything, plates, faces, even the barrels they carried. When Frank replayed the footage later, his suspicion hardened into certainty. One of the men was Carl Bennett, his neighbor and supposed friend. The next afternoon, Frank confronted him at the general store. Carl froze when he saw Frank holding a flash drive. "We need to talk," Frank said quietly. They stepped behind the building away from curious eyes. "You ratted me out," Carl spat. "You poisoned my land," Frank replied. "Why?" Carl's face twisted. "You think you can fight them? Weston owns half the county already. The sheriff's in their pocket, the bank too. I just took what they offered, a clean payout. Better than losing everything." Frank's voice dropped. "You sold your honor for a check." Carl looked down, shame flickering across his face. "You don't get it. They'll crush you next." Frank turned to leave. "Let them try." That night, Frank called Emily at the university. He trusted her sharp mind and instincts. "I need you to dig into Weston and Company," he said. "Look for any links to county officials or campaign donations." Emily spent the next days combing through public records and news archives. "Dad," she said during a late call, "there's something. The county commissioner's wife is listed as a board advisor for Weston. It's buried under a shell company, but it's them." Frank smiled grimly. That's our thread. Over the next week, he gathered more evidence, photographs, recordings, soil samples. He documented everything like a soldier writing field reports. But he knew evidence alone wasn't enough. He needed a plan. Martha watched him late one evening, her hands clasped tightly. "You're back in that mode," she said, "like you were before deployment." Frank looked up from the table. "If I don't stop them, they'll destroy every family around here. Harold tried alone and paid for it. I won't let that happen again." He checked the batteries in the camera, loaded fresh film, and folded Harold's letter back into his jacket pocket. Outside, the field shimmered under the moonlight, beautiful, fragile, and worth every risk. Frank took a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The war he'd thought was over had simply changed its battlefield. Eyes hung in the air like a prayer, quiet, heavy, unbreakable. Frank knew collecting evidence wasn't enough. He'd seen how corruption worked. It didn't crumble under proof alone. It had to be cornered, exposed in daylight. He needed them to reveal themselves. That morning, a sleek white SUV rolled up his driveway again. The Weston and Company logo gleamed on the door. Charles Weston himself stepped out wearing his usual city grin. Behind him was Commissioner Dale Warren, the same man who'd once cut ribbons at every local fair. Their presence together confirmed everything Frank and Emily had uncovered. Mr. Doyle Weston began smoothly, "I hope you've reconsidered our offer. We're willing to double the initial price. Cash, no questions asked." Frank leaned against the fence, calm but watchful. "I might be willing to talk," he said, "but I'll need everything on paper and the commissioner's signature right here on my property. No office talk." Weston smiled, thinking he'd won. "Of course," he said. "Let's schedule it for Friday." That night, Frank gathered his family around the kitchen table. Luke's eyes burned with anger, Emily's laptop glowed with spreadsheets and documents, and Martha stood behind them, silent but strong. "They'll come to close the deal," Frank said, "and when they do, they'll expose themselves." He showed them a small wireless recorder disguised inside a pen and a camera hidden in the kitchen clock. Emily would monitor everything from the truck parked near the barn. The moment they talk numbers and favors, we'll have them. Martha put a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful, Frank. They won't hesitate to ruin you if they find out." Frank met her gaze. They already tried. Friday came bright and clear. The wheat shimmered in the wind as the black SUV returned, followed by 2 county cars. Weston, Warren, and 2 assistants stepped out with folders and briefcases. Inside the farmhouse, the mood was civil at first. Weston spread the contract on the table. "Here's our revised proposal. As you'll see, we've accounted for the bank's loan." Frank cut in. "How would you know about my loan?" Weston paused, exchanging a glance with Warren. The commissioner cleared his throat. "We have sources. Let's just say we're trying to make this easy for everyone." Luke, standing by the counter, clenched his jaw. Frank kept his voice even. "You mean you pressured the bank?" Warren smiled faintly. "Now, Frank, no need for ugly words. You sell, everyone wins. You hold out and you'll drown in fees and inspections." The recorder caught every word. Emily, watching from the truck, whispered, "Got them." Just then, Luke noticed movement outside a truck idling near the north field, 2 men unloading something near the water trench. His stomach dropped. "Daddy," hissed, "they're doing it again." Frank stood abruptly. "Meeting's over." He walked to the door, but one of Weston's men blocked him. "You agreed to finish the paperwork." Frank's voice turned cold. "You just finished it yourself." He shoved past the man and sprinted toward the field. Luke followed. They caught one worker pouring a chemical mix into the irrigation line. Frank tackled him down, the smell of poison burning his throat. The man panicked. "It's not my fault. They said just do it or I'd lose my job." By the time Frank looked back, Weston's SUV was gone, leaving only dust. That night, Emily uploaded the recordings and video to a secure drive. The evidence was undeniable: threats, coercion, and sabotage, all caught in one afternoon. As the family sat exhausted at the table, Martha placed Harold's letter beside the recorder. "You've got what he died for," she said softly. Frank nodded, eyes hard. "Now it's time the whole world sees it." The trap had been sprung, and the men who thought they owned the county had just walked straight into it. Frank didn't sleep that night. He sat by the kitchen table, the glow of the old lamp casting long shadows across Harold's letter, the recorder, and the printed still frames from Emily's footage. Every piece of evidence told the same story, greed wearing a friendly smile. He knew where to take it, but he also knew the local sheriff and county court were already compromised. Going through them would be suicide. There was only one man he trusted enough to reach above it all, Governor Allen Price, his old commanding officer from Iraq. They hadn't spoken in over a decade, but the man had once told him, "If you ever find a war worth fighting again, call me first." Frank picked up the phone and dialed the number from an old contact card still tucked inside his wallet. It rang twice before a familiar gravelly voice answered. "Frank Doyle." "Well, I'll be damned. You still breathing?" "Barely," Frank said. "I've got something, Allen. Something big. Corruption, poison, land grabs, the whole deal. They're killing farmers to take their property, and it's spreading." Allen's tone shifted instantly. "You have proof?" "More than enough." "Send it, quietly. I'll handle the rest." Within hours, Frank and Emily compiled everything into a secure file and sent it to a private address Allen provided. 2 days later, an unmarked state vehicle pulled up outside the farm. Inside sat 2 investigators and a journalist from the Kansas State Tribune, all sent under the governor's discretion. They listened carefully as Frank laid out the timeline from the first dead cow to the staged meeting and the recordings. "This is bigger than we thought," one agent murmured. "You're sitting on a full-blown racketeering case." Allen called that night. "Frank, I can't make this public yet. They'll cover their tracks before we even start. But Weston's hosting a public ceremony this weekend, groundbreaking for that resort project. Every major player will be there, including Commissioner Warren. You up for one last mission?" Frank smiled faintly. "Always." The day of the ceremony was cloudless and hot. A makeshift stage stood on the edge of what used to be Harold's land. Reporters and cameras crowded in as Weston and Company unveiled banners reading Redfield Renewal Project. Warren stood proudly beside Weston, microphones flashing in their faces. Frank waited by the fence line with Luke, Emily, and 2 plainclothes agents nearby. His old field instincts kicked in the calm before an operation. Weston stepped to the podium. "This project will bring prosperity to Redfield," he said grandly. "A new chapter for this community." The loudspeaker crackled. His voice was cut off by another Allen Price's, clear and commanding. "Before we celebrate, perhaps we should tell the people what this land really cost." Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. The screens behind the stage flickered, then switched to live footage. Weston and Warren in Frank's kitchen, their words caught on camera, threats, bribes, and the confession of tampering with the bank. Gasps erupted. Weston froze, color draining from his face. Warren stammered, This is out of context." Police cars appeared at the edge of the field, sirens blaring. State investigators marched toward the stage, badges raised. "Charles Weston Dale Warren, you're under arrest for conspiracy, environmental tampering, and extortion." Frank stood still as chaos unfolded. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, the wind whipped through the wheat. Warren tried to push through the crowd but was stopped by agents. Weston simply hung his head. When Allen Price stepped forward, he found Frank among the onlookers. The 2 men clasped hands, soldier to soldier. "You did good, Doyle," Allen said quietly. "You kept your oath." Frank looked out across the field, the same field they'd tried to steal. "It wasn't just my oath," he said. "It was Harold's too." As the arrested men were led away, Frank felt the weight of months lift from his chest. Justice hadn't come quickly, but it had come like dawn breaking over the plains. 2 weeks after the arrests, Redfield was different. The air felt lighter, the horizon cleaner. The banners that once promised a resort community were gone, replaced by rows of hay bales and the sound of tractors again. Life was returning to the land, slow, honest, and unbought. Frank's name had made the state papers. Veteran farmer exposes corruption ring. Reporters came from nearby towns wanting interviews, but he turned them all away. "I'm no hero," he told one persistent journalist. "I just didn't sell out." Governor Price called once more to thank him. "Frank, you've given this state a reminder of what integrity looks like," he said. "We're working to clear Harold Jenkins's name and restore his family's land." Frank's voice softened. "That's the only recognition that matters." When he hung up, he walked out to the field. Luke was repairing a section of the fence, and Tommy was helping shovel grain into the silo. Martha stood by the porch talking to Emily, who had just returned home from college with a small camera crew from her journalism class. "You sure you're okay with us filming a piece about what happened?" Emily asked. Frank smiled faintly. "Just tell it straight. Don't turn it into a movie." She laughed. "You underestimate how cinematic your life's been lately." That evening they gathered for dinner, steak, potatoes, and cornbread, Harold's favorite meal. Martha had lit a candle at the center of the table beside a framed photo of Harold and Linda from years ago. They ate in quiet remembrance. After the plates were cleared, Frank walked out alone to the fence line. The sun was setting behind the hills, bathing the wheat in a deep amber glow. In his hand was a small wooden plaque he had carved himself. It read, "For Harold Jenkins, who stood his ground when others fell." He knelt and placed it near the fence post that bordered Harold's old property. The sound of the wind through the wheat filled the silence. Luke joined him, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You really think it's over, Dad?" Frank looked toward the horizon. "For us, maybe. But men like Weston, there'll always be more of them. That's why we stand. Because if we don't, they win." Luke nodded, the weight of those words sinking deep. Later that week, Linda Jenkins and her 2 children visited. She carried a folded deed. The land officially returned to her name. Tears filled her eyes as she looked out over the empty barn. "Harold would have been proud of you, Frank," she said. Frank shook his head gently. "He just ran out of time. I only finished what he started." As night fell, Emily set up her small camera to record one last interview. The farm was quiet except for the soft chirping of crickets. "Dad," she said from behind the lens, "if you could say one thing to people watching this, what would it be?" Frank looked straight into the camera, his weathered face calm, the lines around his eyes deepened by the setting sun. "They wanted this land because they saw profit. We kept it because we saw roots. Every acre here is written with sweat, memory, and loss. When you sell your ground, you sell a piece of yourself. And once it's gone, you don't get it back." He paused, then added quietly, "Honor doesn't live in medals or uniforms. It lives in what you protect when no one's watching." Emily lowered the camera slowly, eyes glassy. Frank turned toward the horizon where fireflies blinked above the wheat like tiny stars. The wind rolled across the field, whispering through the stalks. He closed his eyes and whispered, almost to Harold, almost to himself, "The land is free again." And as the last light faded, the Doyles' farm stood strong, not rich, not grand, but sacred, a living promise kept by a soldier, a friend, and a man who never forgot his oath.